Hey everyone, Duke here, and today we're doing a damage test of sorts across 4 popular linear fusion rifles: Stormchaser, Reed's Regret, Cataclysmic, and Sleeper. These tests are meant to give an idea of some of the pluses and minuses of each of these weapons, and are certainly not perfect nor scientific. I will go over some of the theoretical damage numbers at points, but the main goal of this video is to use them in a scenario in which I'm far from perfect at hitting shots, mainly because I can't hit the shots, and consider ease of use when comparing weapons. Do note that all of the legendary weapons we're going over will have boss spec on them, as I'd expect that to be used in all scenarios when you're using a linear fusion rifle that's legendary against a boss, so that will be a part of the damage. We're also using Well of Radiance and Divinity in these tests, as I feel like those are very commonly used in raid scenarios, and at least for me, I like to think about things in a raid setting and raid scenarios because that's what I like to do and what I like to play, so that's why we're using both of those. Starting off with a rapid hit Vorpal Stormchaser, which you can definitely add a little bit of DPS if you're using a firing line Stormchaser, and of course if you're proccing it, because firing line gives a 20% damage buff versus Vorpal's 10, but I thought this would be a good baseline. We have a 37,063 per shot single burst of Stormchaser, single burst meaning one of the 3 burst shots, so if you multiply that by 3, it's doing 111,189 per full burst. Stormchaser has 19 shots total with no reserves, which means that there is a maximum total damage of 2,112,591. The actual damage I was able to put out was 1,764,774, and it took a total of 27 seconds to do that. That gives us a total DPS of 65,362, which would be closer to 70,000 if you were using a firing line Stormchaser. The upside here is it definitely does a ridiculous amount of damage per burst and for how many shots it has and how fast you can shoot them. The downside is you definitely get punished for not hitting crits. So Stormchaser is definitely a great option, but keep in mind the ability to consistently hit crits if and when you're going to choose this weapon. Next we have a Reed's Regret with Clown Cartridge and Vorpal Weapon. Reed's is doing 77,356 damage per shot, again with Vorpal, and has 20 shots total. This gives us a maximum theoretical damage of 1,547,120, with the actual damage output that I was able to do at 1,272,181. Now the upside of Reed's is that it has Vice Stinger, which can potentially reload your mag at any point, and this happened quite a few times during this clip, and only took me 21.5 seconds to do all of 20 shots that Reed's has. This is obviously something that is not really mathematical, it's a much more RNG-based situation in terms of how often your Vice Stinger is going to proc, so your damage is definitely going to swing a bit more on Reed's, even if you are using it perfectly, compared to something like Stormchaser. My DPS in this scenario with Reed's was 59,171, and again with Firing Line would instead be something closer to 64,000. Next we have Cataclysmic, and I wanted to go over 2 rolls, starting with 4th times the charm and Bait and Switch. With Bait and Switch procced, we were doing 90,685 damage per shot, and we have 20 total shots in Cataclysmic. However, with 4th times the charm pulling ammo from thin air every time you get a proc, you actually have a chance to get a maximum of 32 shots if you hit every single shot perfectly and always proc 4th times the charm. This gives us a maximum theoretical damage of just over 2.9 million, but obviously would take a lot longer to shoot 32 shots, and is actually around 2.8 million just due to needing to proc Bait and Switch for each mag. The actual damage we were able to do was 1,804,075, and this took us the full 30-second damage window. Also note that we were using Wither Horde and an SMG here to do a little bit of damage just to proc Bait and Switch, and actually went ahead and took every single frame in and every single shot that I took with the LFR, with the Cataclysmic, and I did 1.5 million, 1,510,383 damage just with the LFR, if that is something that interests you. However, in a scenario where you're using Bait and Switch, you're probably going to be using Wither Horde, so I feel like the Wither Horde damage should be included, and the total DPS in that scenario was 60,136. Now the nice thing with Bait and Switch is it's a 35% damage buff, but the downside is it cannot re-proc while it's still up. So you have to wait for the full 10-second damage window and then reproc it. If you're able to hit consistent crits, like very consistent crits, this is a really, really good weapon, especially with fourth times, because you're able to get 10 in the mag, and the timing of the reloads and kind of reprocking your bait and switch ends up being just about perfect. But the second you miss one single crit, it kind of throws everything off, because then you're not going to get as many shots in the mag from fourth times, and you're going to end up either just needing to kind of sit there doing nothing, or just not reproc your bait and switch at all. So it really throws things off if you're not pretty much exactly perfect with bait and switch. However, as shown with the total theoretical max damage, this is an insane weapon for a really long DPS phase. Next we have Cataclysmic with Focus Fury and 4th times the charm. This was doing 79,024 damage per shot with Focus Fury procced, with again 20 shots, but again also has the maximum of 32 shots if you hit every 4th times the charm perfectly. And the couple shots before Focus Fury is procced, we're doing 65,857. We have a theoretical damage of 2,528,768, but is actually just under 2.5 million due to needing those first 3 shots to be crits to proc Focus Fury in the first place. Here we spent about 29 seconds doing DPS, and our actual damage was 1,682,478 for a total DPS of 58,016. This damage is slightly lower than bait and switch, as you'd expect for a 20% damage buff versus a 35% damage buff. However, it is a much easier time to be pulled off, and I believe the floor is going to be a lot better than something like bait and switch, where you can very easily potentially just get no damage buff in a less than ideal scenario. Because with Focus Fury, as soon as you get those 3 first crits, you're going to have 10 seconds of the 20% damage, and then as long as you're getting another 3 crits within that time period, you're going to be able to instantly re-up it to that 10 seconds. You don't have to wait for the full 10 seconds to drop off. It can re-proc itself while still being up. So it's much easier to use. And finally, we used Sleeper, which was doing 113,178 damage per shot for 13 shots. This gave us a 1,471,314 total damage as our maximum theoretical damage, and it took us 19 seconds to get all 13 shots off for an actual damage of 1,306,272. This gave us a DPS of 68,751, which is actually the highest DPS that we did out of all of these, and shows at the very least that Sleeper is certainly competitive. A couple things I'd like to add with Sleeper. Obviously it has lower mag and has no way to get a bigger mag other than reserves, but everything can use reserves. I just mean in the either triple tap or 4th times the charm way of getting ammo from thin air, it cannot do that. Secondly, I feel like Sleeper has a much higher floor than a lot of these weapons because missing crits is not nearly as punishing. It does significantly more damage than some of the other legendary linear fusions do. If you miss a crit with those, Sleeper still hits quite hard even when missing crits. However, again, the downside here, even though it does have a high DPS and a high floor, it has a very low ceiling in terms of, again, not having any way to get bigger reserves with triple tap or 4th times the charm. It doesn't have any sort of damage buffs or things that you can be proccing. In a longer DPS phase, you're going to run out of ammo, which means your DPS is going to tank. Again, you can definitely still throw in maybe like a sniper or a slug shotgun, depending on the situation to go with it, if it is a longer DPS phase and you wanted to use Sleeper. But the Sleeper itself, or the linear fusion rifle comparison itself, in a longer DPS phase, some of these other weapons are definitely going to take over and allow you to do more total damage. And one final thing to consider is Font of Might. This mod requires you to pick up elemental wells that are the same damage type as your subclass, and will give you a damage buff in return. This is going to give an advantage to certain weapons based on what you're running. For something like Well of Radiance, obviously being solar, you're going to have an advantage on either Sleeper or Cataclysmic with the ability to proc Font of Might. Running a Stasis Hunter can be very strong with Reed's Regret, as you're able to make Stasis Wells just by popping your super. However, you do lose out on the damage from something like Blade Barrage or potentially the Triple Tether. And then on a Thundercrash Titan, Stormchaser might have an even additional damage buff if you're able to make those Arc Elemental Wells, and next season, being Arc 3.0, some of these other Arc subclasses may be more relevant, and Stormchaser could become even stronger. Overall, I take this as honestly all of these weapons being very viable and very strong options. Some of them, again, have higher floors or higher ceilings. A lot of it is going to depend on your ability to hit crits, especially when using things like triple tap or fourth time's the charm, or the ability for you to multitask and switching weapons with stuff like bait and switch. Again, this test is definitely not scientific in terms of the true DPS numbers that I was doing. It's very dependent on if I'm hitting my shots or not. Hopefully some of the max total damage gives you some ideas in terms of, you know, a shorter DPS window versus a longer DPS window. Sleeper definitely being competitive in shorter windows, but definitely falling off in a potential longer damage window. For me as well, I think it showed just how strong triple tap and or fourth time's a charm can be if you are hitting your crits consistently, just because of how many extra shots you're going to be able to get in your reserves. Hopefully this testing and the numbers and some of my thoughts to go along with it were helpful. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.